for years, Canadians were concerned about American investment here, and we had FIRA, and it was mostly about, overseeing deals that the Americans wanted. Is this worse?
Yes, this is worse. And this is worse, again, not because I'm anti-Chinese. That would be, or even, I wouldn't say for a moment that we should withdraw from a growing diplomatic and respectful relationship with China that also allows us to say very firmly, it is not acceptable to us and offends our values that the occupation of Tibet is so brutal. It is not acceptable to us and offends our values that political dissidents are in jail. It is not acceptable to us and offends our values that our kids are buying toys made by prison labor from China. There are a lot of things that offend our values that we should be able to say in a way to the government of China that is allowed to carry some sway. But in our relationships with the U.S., it always used to be the notion that, was it Pierre Trudeau who said it's like the mouse sleeping with the elephant? Well, get ready for it. This is the elephant and the flea. Well, we have some serious issues here, particularly because these are not free enterprise corporations subject to rules and regulations of a like-minded country. These are corporations where the directorship of the boards is chosen by the Communist Party of China. There have got to be some significant differences here, which at least are worth teasing out in terms of saying to the government of China, yes, we welcome your investment if we decide that's a good idea, but these are some sovereign Canadian concerns which must be identified. We need some firewalls here around labor protection. We need, in other words, it needs to be discussed. When you're dealing with investments from, and I certainly have concerns as a Canadian about our sovereignty, but yes, the multinationals that are in the oil sands right now include a lot of U.S. money and some other state-owned enterprises, by the way. A Korean state-owned oil company, Norwegian state-owned oil company. But those countries operate with greater scrutiny over how their corporations behave because their corporations and their government are not one and the same. And their corporations and their government are not one and the same, controlled by one party that doesn't allow anyone to run against it. So the lack of transparency, the issues about how good a fit it is for Canada to have PetroChina, Sinopec, and the China Offshore Oil Corporation operating in Canada, as though this was just great news for all. I go back briefly, Julie, to the controversy over min metals. What has happened? The idea that min metals might buy up a big stake in our mining industry became controversial. It was debated, and we decided it wasn't in our interest. But there's been not a murmur, not a discussion under the Foreign Investment Review Act of whether, but somewhere between, we've tried to trace it, it's somewhere between $12 billion in the last few years and $20 billion in the last few years, not counting, because we're not quite sure what the total investment stake of Chinese enterprises is in the Enbridge project. We just know they're big backers. You take that as a total and say, how did even $2 billion get invested without any form of public discussion or review by the Foreign Investment Review Act? I mean, the horse is way out of the barn door on this one.
Just to clarify, were you saying that they now have veto authority? They can say, listen, we're not going to refine this in Canada. That's like, they can prevent that, actually, and force export of unprocessed.
Only in relation to products out of Syncrude, where they have a 9% ownership share. They bought up ConocoPhillips' share, so they become, Sinopec ends up sitting at a board table where I think they're one of 10. And any one of those 10 can block a decision to refine the oil in Canada and can insist it be exported. Which fits neatly with the China Enbridge scheme.
What exactly is Sinopec's stake in the Northern Gateway then, do you know?
We know that Chinese investment is significant backers. We know that there was a starting amount of $100 million, which is obviously small potatoes, put into the regulatory preparation work. And that's that Sinopec is part of a consortium that put together the $100 million. That's bullet point 2 in the press release. So this is one of the questions that I'd like answered. I mean, I asked in the House of Commons last week in question period why we weren't asking the questions about Chinese state enterprise ownership stake in the oil sands, and particularly the Enbridge pipeline scheme. The answer was to another question that often happens in question period. But I do think that there are conservatives who are concerned about this too. I do not think this is really a partisan issue in the sense, I mean, I'm raising it because I'm able to. These issues have been brought to light. I'm very concerned. Obviously, the Green Party position is that we shouldn't be expanding the oil sands at all from where we are. We need to stop the expansion and allow some of the newer technologies and science that's being developed that would drastically reduce the energy and water input to development in the oil sands. We will never get the new technologies that, by the way, there was a reception on Parliament Hill a few days ago where NSERC had a display of some of the best new science coming along, and it's fantastic. But those new technologies are never going to have a chance to be commercialized when the current technology can be approved in this boom of expansion, where it seems that the Prime Minister's goal is to get the bitumen crude out of the country as fast as possible. He wants it to go to the Texas refineries on the Gulf of Mexico coast, which the Alberta oil unions estimate will cost over 40,000 jobs to Canadians. And he wants to get it into this twinned pipeline that moves it to Kitimat, where, by the way, for 40 years, there's been a moratorium on oil tanker traffic in those waters, and for good reason. Those are not just some of the most dangerous waters in Canada, they're the most dangerous waters on the planet. And there it is completely inappropriate that we've gotten this far along in the promotion of, and in fact, of course, of Minister of Natural Resources and the Prime Minister, decrying the fact that there's even delay in approving something where it can't even get off the ground unless we ignore a 40-year moratorium that's been observed by every provincial and federal government since 1972. So the fact that China is backing the pipeline, China is invested in the oil sands, again, this is not about us, or, I mean, the timing is absurd that the Prime Minister would suggest that because Keystone was turned down, and I'm afraid only temporarily, by Barack Obama, he then had to turn to China to teach the U.S. a lesson. I mean, I suppose some spin doctor at PMO thought that would be a clever line, but just follow the money. Sinopec and PetroChina and these companies have been invested in Canada for way before the Keystone Pipeline was turned down, and their investment hinges on being able to deliver it to their markets and their refineries and their workers, and that means that there's a presumption on the part of the government of China that the government of Canada will be compliant and make sure that they overturn a 40-year moratorium on oil tanker traffic, ignore or bulldoze through the concerns of First Nations and all of the communities along that pipeline route that object to it being built. So it's a very, at the level of geopolitics, where's our sovereignty here?
How do you know that that investment in China, that they were just trying to develop resources, you know, in other countries, that it actually hinged on them exporting it to China?
Well, it could be the case that China would be happy, Sinopec might be happy to have its oil from its oil sands operations, and then there's other investments, by the way, in Fort McKay, and there's another number of oil projects. It's not just the veto power on Syncrude. One could suppose that they would live with a ruling that their bitumen crude gets refined in Canada, and the profits that are made on their product support Canadian jobs. But if the narrative, and particularly since it's not been publicly discussed, the fact that China's been investing, China wants to have it be bitumen crude that's exported. I mean, that's the whole point of the Enbridge project, is that we're not refining our product here. We're shipping it to Asia. So I don't think it's much of a leap of logic to go 2 + 2 makes 4. These guys are investing in the oil sands. They're investing in the Enbridge China pipeline tanker project. So therefore, that's a rather comprehensive package to get bitumen crude to China, not refine it in Canada.
When you talked about Sinopec being involved in Syria and everything being interrelated in the sense that the Security Council obviously didn't clamp down on Syria, and China and Russia were instrumental in this, could the Prime Minister have been more forceful in dealing with the Chinese to, I don't know, get them to change their mind about Syria or something, since they obviously want to do business with Canada?
It would have been interesting if he'd postponed his trip, for instance. I mean, it's a very delicate balance. I think, by the way, in foreign policy overall, the Harper Conservatives are ignoring the importance of maintaining a robust diplomatic corps. They're talking about closing down embassies overseas. They've done a lot of that already. I think that the diplomatic efforts needed to be ramped up, and as a signal to China, even saying, oh, we can't leave Ottawa yet. We need to work on the crisis in Syria for a few more days before we make it to Beijing. It would have been, I think, a subtle but very effective message. I think canceling the trip would have been seen as a slap in the face to China, from which we might not have recovered. As it's clear that Stephen Harper probably did, in the interest of Canada-China rapport, take too long to go the first time. But the pendulum has swung far too far in the wrong direction, to where whatever he said in private to Chinese leadership, and he said what he says in private will remain in private, but whatever he said in private can't carry any weight compared to the visit itself, which speaks volumes. He's the only Western leader to, at this point, have visited with China since the UN Security Council vote. I think it would have been very well received had he picked up the phone and talked to other world leaders and said, look, I think I need to send China a message. How do all of you feel that it would help our joint efforts to get rid of Assad if I delay my trip to China by a day or two to send a signal and a message? I mean, it would have inconvenienced some of the oil industry executives he was taking with him. It would have obviously been a diplomatic difficulty, but I think it would have sent a much clearer message than going off to China as if nothing was wrong. And clearly, China's interest in Syria, as in China's interest in Sudan, has a lot to do with oil, as did the U.S. interest in Iran.
I'm not going to sign any of these trade deals till you
that would
slap Syria's wrist.
Well, that's the next step up. I mean, signing these trade deals, which, by the way, we've seen so much public debate and discussion in Canada because groups are concerned about the comprehensive economic trade agreement with the European Union. This came out of nowhere, and it's been signed. Investment state provisions are corrosive to democracy, fundamentally corrosive, because they give a corporation the power to sue a democratically elected government. Now we've given the Communist Party of China the right to sue any level of government in Canada if they don't like a decision we've made, because it would potentially reduce their profits. And it's being heralded as though it's great news. This is disastrous news.
Because he signed many that gives the government, the Chinese government, the right to sue.
The investor state provisions. They call them investor protections, and what we're hearing about in Canada, of course, is good news for Canadian business people who go to China because their investment will be protected. Okay? All right. Maybe if China observes this treaty and a Canadian business person feels abused by a decision of the Chinese government, our investors can sue. But so too can the much larger player here, which is the Chinese investments in the oil sands, and there's other Chinese investments across Canada. And if they don't like a decision, I mean, the history of Chapter 11 of NAFTA is horrific in terms of what it's meant for local decision making. Whether it was a local community in Mexico that told the U.S. corporation Metalclad it didn't want a toxic waste facility next to their water supply, they ended up owing money. When Canada said we will no longer export PCB contaminated wastes, we ended up owing SD Myers money. We ended up owing Ethel Corporation of Richmond, Virginia money when we banned a magnesium-based gasoline additive. So take those quite horrific examples and multiply by 1 million. And imagine what happens when we decide to, for instance, ramp up our controls on greenhouse gases, which we're going to have to do, improve water quality standards, provide new legislation to say, well, this is now a protected area and we need to take a corner off this particular oil sands area because of any range of future scenarios that involve legitimate exercise of the regulation-making powers of the Government of Canada from duly elected, democratically elected members of Parliament, and you could face a whopping lawsuit under the investor state provisions. And by the way, investor state provisions operate like private arbitration rules, so there really is no court, there is no hearing. They don't even have to publish the fact that the complaint has been made. It's all done through basically arbitration hearings in a hotel room somewhere where the trade lawyers for usually, up until now, private corporations in the United States primarily that want to sue Canada we've now opened this up. We were concerned enough about having this expanded to all the European nations and all the European corporations that might want to sue Canada over, for instance, pharmaceuticals versus generics. Anything, it doesn't have to be to qualify under an investor state law the way it's ruled. It does not have to have been based on bad science, does not have to have been in any way protectionist, it doesn't have to have been using any motive to impede the trade with the other country. All you have to do to end up owing another corporation from another country money is do anything that reduces their expectation of profit. Even legitimate health, safety, environmental regulations will cause, under these investor state rules, Canada to pay out money and abandon our efforts in that area. I've seen it happen too many times under Chapter 11 of NAFTA. To see this extended to China as though it's good news is deeply, deeply shocking. And I hope Canadians will take on this issue and make sure that any investor state provisions in any trade deal with China don't go through, and that we open up the question of where is the money? Who is the backer of the Enbridge China pipeline tanker scheme? Let's get it out on the table, and let's have a foreign investment review process, and let's ensure that we haven't already. I mean, a lot of Canadian sovereignty is already gone here. Let's hang on to what we have and exert it while we still have time.
We have time for 2 short questions and 2 short answers.
Legislation on this? You say it has to happen?
On the passing a trade deal, the trade deals do go through the House of Commons. Now, of course, everything that goes through the House of Commons these days goes through with a bulldozer, and we won't have the votes to stop them. But if the Canadian public finds out about it, the same way that Canadians are finding out about changes to old age security, as people find out about things and mobilize, perhaps we can get this trade deal to be reviewed and to remove the investor state provisions. That's clearly the most dangerous part of any trade deal anywhere around the world.
I'm not sure how much you've looked at Chinese foreign investment in other countries. Is there any lesson there for us?
Well, they bought up a great amount of there's a tremendous amount of Africa that's been purchased by Chinese interests, both for growing food in Africa so that they can take agricultural land in China and industrialize it, as well as for vast areas of solar arrays. China, by the way, put about $600 billion into renewable energy in the last number of years. So as I said, there's some things they're doing that are interesting and progressive in terms of getting off fossil fuels, as much as they are still burning a tremendous amount of fossil fuels. There's also the investment. China owns both sides of the Panama Canal. China has investment interests all around the world. And it is clearly, I mean, if you look at who owns U.S. debt, I mean, these are no surprises. China is a superpower. At the end of the Cold War, we thought maybe the age of superpowers was over. But the emerging superpower, holding debt paper, owning large tracts of access to mineral resources in Africa, access to oil in Canada, access to oil elsewhere all around the world. China's been very effective, very strategic. It has the money. It's making an enormous transformation in its own society. I have tremendous empathy for the challenges of a country as large as China, with a population with as many differences. You talk about the 99% and the 1%. The differences between the very poor and the wealthy in China are staggering.
Is there, I mean, politically, how they've maybe used that foreign investment?
I can't. I'd have to look into that more deeply. I think, frankly, that it looks much more as though, particularly in the developing world, China has just bought things up. I think chances are that there's been more scrutiny in Europe, but I'd need to double check. Any last?
Okay, quick. Nope.
No.
Just answer this quickly. What's happened to Stephen Harper that he was so intransigent about China just a few years ago, and now he's guns blazing?
Well, Stephen Harper and China have joined in a new axis of oil, and the axis of oil, in Stephen Harper's mind, anything that he used to care about, whether it was human rights or protecting Canadian jobs, will be sacrificed for oil. That's his driving motive, and it seems to be the only value that he holds high and immutable, is to get out as much Canadian oil as fast as possible and ship it to other countries.
Do that.
That's something you'll have to ask him. Thank you.